Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is insinuating that she is considering either running for president or Senate in 2028. And this statement has been met with a mixture of enthusiasm and trepidation from the Democratic voter populace. And honestly, given the current political situation, I think I can kind of understand where they're coming from. In a way, it's really a shame to see the lack of enthusiasm to this announcement. A few years ago, the idea of her putting her hat in the ring for president would be met with universal praise amongst the more progressive side of the Democratic electorate. But I think some of the shine has worn off her star in the last few years. Amongst the real progressive side of Democrats, her lack of support for Palestine and her seeming desire to continue Biden-era support of Israel has kind of soured her relationship with the ultra-progressives of the party. Some people are saying that while the idea of her running for president sounds good on paper, that given how disastrous the Kamala Harris campaign was in this previous election against Donald Trump, and how badly she lost amongst groups that going into the election the pollsters were pretty sure she would take, have made them a bit hesitant to run yet another woman of color to that office. And it does make sense that after they lost a major election, the idea of possibly doing the same thing again, which would likely result in the same outcome, doesn't sound very appealing to many. While AOC has lost a lot of her standing with the ultra-progressives on the Democratic side, a lot of people still really like her. They still see her as a sort of younger successor to Bernie Sanders, a figure that a lot of younger progressive Democrats have for a long time gravitated towards. So seeing her as sort of a Bernie Jr. has been something that has gotten her a lot of praise and a lot of support. So the notion of putting up a candidate that has a lot of younger progressive support for many sounds appealing. And they're saying, well, this is the time when the Democrats need new blood, new image. She's the perfect candidate to run at this time. Conversely, a lot of people are saying that's the exact opposite. She's too progressive for a lot of the more conservative-leaning Democrats and centrists, so that getting her a winning amount of votes in a presidential election would be nearly impossible. And that really, if they ran her as the Democratic candidate, all they're going to get is another loss. How accurate that is hard to say, since of course it's all speculation. But those that are downplaying a forthcoming presidential run think that her place would be better served not in the presidency, but in the Senate, replacing old Chuck Schumer. And I think to a lot of degree, they do have a good point. That they say, look, she's only 35, she's very young, maybe it would be better to have her spend her time in the Senate where she can do more good, and then in the future, use that as a springboard into a presidential run. So not in 2028, but some future election. And that isn't a bad strategy. I think there are a lot of good points towards having her run as the Democratic candidate for presidency in this upcoming election. But I also think that there is a lot of good points that right now almost doesn't feel the time for a candidate like her. That yes, she does have a lot of populist support. Yes, she's very popular amongst younger voters and progressives, but trying to push her on a more centrist, more conservative-leaning Democratic electorate would be difficult in the best of times and nearly impossible in the current time, especially because given how hardline the Republicans have been, they would just eviscerate her and they would run smear campaign, they would run just any possible negative press they could to muddy the waters so that not only could she not pick up a lot of older Democratic votes, but it would eliminate entirely any possibility of picking up any moderate Republican votes who might be registered Republican but be willing to vote for the Democratic candidate if they still aligned with some of their views and values. So it's tough because obviously, number one, the Democrats need new blood. They need new ideas. And she's been sort of the poster child for a possible new Democratic image in line with prospective New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. A lot of her support base is there, and I think you can probably assume that unlike previous Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, AOC could pick up a lot of younger female votes and probably a lot of younger male votes. And so regardless whether she ran for the highest office or if she ran for Senate, there's a good chance that she could get a lot of votes that a lot of older Democrats running for those same positions may not, because there's this image that she has a youth and vitality that most Democrats in government lack. I think what I find disheartening is that while I want to be all on the AOC president train, I have to admit that I see a lot of the flaws that people point out in her trying to run for president, especially given how the previous election went. While it's true that a lot of the Republican wins came from disinformation from their point, smear campaigns on Harris from them, but a lot of it was that a great deal of the Democratic voting base just didn't want to vote for a woman of color. There's unfortunately a lot of sexism and racism still within the Democratic Party. They like to think of themselves as the more progressive party, and the Republicans and the GOP as more of the racist, sexist people. But the honest truth is that unfortunately it is a trait that crosses party lines, and I think we found that a lot of younger men were just not interested in voting for a woman at all, and a lot of people of color were not interested in voting for a woman of color specifically. So running a second, though younger, woman of color for the presidency probably would be very difficult and possibly not advisable. And I hate that that's the reality that we find ourselves in, but I honestly feel as if that is what's happening. That if she received the Democratic nomination for president, we would just see more Republican rule because she would lose the general election. And that doesn't feel like it's just being negative for the sake of being negative. I think the reality is that at this moment, running a progressive woman of color as the Democratic candidate for president is unfortunately a losing prospect. And I do agree that probably what would be the better solution is that instead of running for president, she goes for Senate, get rid of Chuck Schumer, spend some time in the Senate doing good Senate things, and then revisit the potential presidential run when things have maybe gotten a little better for the country and we've healed a little more from the damage the current administration and the GOP has done to all aspects of the country. I've liked her as a politician for a while because, she's been more progressive, and I think what we've been lacking for far too long is a strong progressive voice in government. And unfortunately, Bernie Sanders is not going to be around forever. So having someone who is just as progressive and out there with it and popular among younger voters, that you can reinvigorate that base into the Democratic electorate is what we desperately need. And I think she's best suited for the Senate right now. She can do the most good in the Senate for a while and then maybe try presidency later. Now, I suppose this is all contingent on whether we even have future elections. There are some out there who are saying that we have experienced our final free and fair election and that the Republicans have taken such great control over the government that we will never vote again, that Donald Trump will have made good on his promise or threat that if he was elected, we would never have to vote again, quote unquote. But I'm not entirely convinced that it's quite that bad yet. But I suppose that remains to be seen, and that is a topic for another episode. But for this episode, that's going to be it. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off another slice of news.